everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mariana, but you can call me Mari. And today we will be talking about my favorite books of 2022. Alright, so this video is so exciting, but first let me drink some water. It is so hot here in Santiago. We're still gonna get through this in the best way possible and still talk about all the books I really loved and enjoyed last year. This is actually my favorite video to record, and it was my first video ever published to my booktube channel last year. So we're coming full circle now, 1 year later, to do this again, and I'm super happy to just be able to do this and to continue my channel this year. So yeah, I divided this video into two sections because first I'm going to talk about my honorable mentions, which are 5 books I read this year that didn't quite make it to the favorites list, but are still books that I enjoyed and really liked. For different reasons, they may not have been like my favorite of all time, but they're still books that I wanted to mention. And then I have my 10 favorite books of this or last year. And to begin with my honorable mentions, I want to talk about a book that is non-fiction, and it is called Women Don't Owe You Pretty by Florence Given. And this one was an informative text about feminism. It taught me a lot about different things that I knew about but I didn't know about. So it presented some of the theories that I have studied and learned throughout my university experience, and then later on in life I've been reading more and more feminist texts. But this one I found to be not only accessible for anybody who wants to learn a little bit more about feminism, but also very interesting in the way that it tackled some of the topics that I hadn't seen before. For example, boundaries. How do we approach boundaries, but not for ourselves only, but for other people? And how do we push those boundaries in our everyday life without noticing it? And how can we fix it and be better as a society and as people? And it tackles things that not only women face, but also men in those areas, in a way that is including everybody, but also making it specific to women. And I just really enjoyed it, so that's why it's in this honorable mentions list. Then we have The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gornichek, and this one was a fantasy novel I read at the beginning of the year. I listened to an audiobook of this novel and I absolutely adored it. It is a retelling of Norse mythology. In this novel, we follow Angerboda, who is a witch, and she is struggling to get through some of the trials that have been put forward by Odin to stop her from living her life. So she's been hiding from him ever since she was killed by him, and this is at the beginning of the novel. She starts developing a relationship with Loki, who is Odin's brother. And then we see her as she goes through her everyday life. It's not as like action-packed a fantasy novel as we would think. It's just an everyday retelling of Norse mythology through Angerboda's eyes. And it's just wonderful. I really like following female protagonists that have different aspects. And this one was more about motherhood and about, you know, loving your children and learning to love your partner even if they're not the best people, and just like seeing the gray areas of relationships in general. So I thoroughly enjoyed this novel, and yeah. And then for my third honorable mention, I want to talk about KKE by Vaishnavi Patel. And this one is actually also a retelling, but it's a retelling of the Indian epic, the Ramayana. And I actually had never heard of that before I read this novel. So it opened my eyes to a whole new area of history that I knew nothing about. I know that there are some gripes against this book because of its accuracies, and because of looking at an antagonist from like a protagonist's perspective can be sometimes difficult. But in my opinion, and from someone who knows nothing about the Indian epic, the Ramayana, I thought it was an incredible piece of fiction that follows another woman protagonist who has very particular belief systems, and we also see polyamorous relationships, which is something I also don't see very often in fiction. And we follow her as she develops her powers. She finds that she has very specific relationships to people in different ways, and her friendship with the other wives of the man she marries is absolutely just wonderful. The way that those female relationships really shape the novel. And again, as you can tell, I like two things. I like women protagonists, I like female friendships, I just like all types of relationships being put forward in different ways in novels. And in this case, we see it through a fantasy novel that is very well written and just very good in general. Then we have The Book Woman of Troublesome Creek. And this one is about a woman who is blue-skinned. And this is a condition that happens in Kentucky historically because of inbreeding and just genetic mutations. People actually developed a condition where their skin was completely blue. And if you Google it, it's very interesting. And we follow the protagonist, who is part of this family that has blue skin and is discriminated against because of it. She is seen as a scientific wonder, but not in the best way possible, because people want to experiment on her against her will. She has to fight off, just people looking at her as if she wasn't human when she is. And she has a deep, deep appreciation and love for books, which is something I really, really loved about this novel. And we follow her as she is trying to live her life as a normal person, but knowing that she has a condition that doesn't allow her to be seen as somebody who is just a person, a human. And it taught me a bunch of different lessons. I learned a lot more about just human communication, but in general, I would say this novel was more about the love of books and the love of stories and the ability that we have to imagine a different world and to escape. The escapism of this novel was incredible. So I really, really, really enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it if you were to read any of my honorable mentions. It would be this one. Lastly, I want to mention a poetry collection by Mary Oliver, because Mary Oliver is my favorite poet, and she's still my favorite poet this year. She was in my list last year, and I didn't want to include her in my favorites because I already included her last year in my 2021 favorites, but I still wanted to mention her on my 2022 honorable mentions with her book Devotions. And in this poetry collection we have her best work supposedly selected and seen as just her general poetry and how it chronologically advanced throughout the years. And actually it's been a beautiful experience to reread some of the poems that I already read in the other collections, but seeing how much she grew over the years and how her poetry evolved in different ways, but it always stayed the same, and it always had that naturalistic, impressive writing that just makes me want to put my head on the page and submerge myself into whatever it is she's writing about. And in this case, I want to read one of the poems. This one is from West Wind, and it is called Number 9. It says, "What did you think love would be like? A summer day? The brambles in their places and the long stretches of mud? Flowers in every field, in every garden, with their soft beaks and their pastel shoulders? On one street after another, the litter ticks in the gutter. In one room after another, the lovers meet, quarrel, sicken, break apart, cry out. One or two leap from windows. Most simply lean, exhausted, their thin arms on the sill. They have done all they could. The golden eagle that lives not far from here has perhaps 1,000 tiny feathers flowing from the back of its head, each one shaped like an infinitely small but perfect spear." it's just so good. She has such a way with words, and that's why I'm gonna leave my honorable mentions for this year. And I need another drink of water. My beautiful, huge ass water bottle. Now we get into the part of the video that I'm just so excited to do and to talk about, which are my favorite books of 2022. In order, from my number 10 to my number 1 favorite book of 2022. And for my number 10, we have a classic. We have The Grey Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And this should come as no surprise for those who have been following me on Bookstagram or Booktube. I read this in July, I believe, and just absolutely adored it. I had never read it before. I never read it in high school. I never read it afterwards for university. So it was my first time experiencing this story, and I thought it was incredible. The descriptions of Gatsby himself as this mysterious entity and the aesthetics surrounding his persona was something that I have never seen in any book before, and the way that it was revealed throughout the novel, and we learn a lot more about him and about the Grey Gatsby, how he came to be this entity, but also we learn a lot more about the other characters, their relationships to each other, how toxic some of them can be, and how nuanced it is to love someone that you can't really have, or that you cannot really be with. And the homoerotic aspects of this novel also surprised me quite a bit, because this was pretty gay. and I truly really liked that. Obviously, but I annotated every single page almost and just talked to the book. I had such a nice discussion. It was also annotated by another person, so I would have conversations with the person in the margins as they would annotate different themes, and I would add to them, which was also just, it added to my reading experience. And you can see like pages like this where I would literally like draw hearts and suns around the page numbers just to remember it forever. I just think it's a novel that I am going to reread again in the future, and I'm just gonna keep rereading it. Anytime I need some comfort, I feel like it's gonna become my comfort novel. Even though I read it in a period of time that was quite weird for me, it made it even better now that I can look back and just regard it as one of my favorite books, probably of all time. One of my favorite classics of all time, probably. So this is my number 10 favorite book of 2022. Then we have another one that should come as no surprise for anybody, which is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. And how rude. Alright, so let's begin talking about this novel, which is a retelling of the Greek myth of Patroclus and Achilles, which historians always talk about as being friends, or like the friendship that developed between these two and the love that they had for each other was always seen within a friendship sphere, but never really understood as something more, when in reality it is probably also known that they were lovers. And so Madeline Miller decided to take all the historical facts and turn them into this novel, which is just a romance novel between Patroclus and Achilles. And if you know the myth, you know how it ends, you know how it develops, and if you know how it ends, you know how sad it is. But not only did it make me cry because of how sad it was, it made me cry because of the writing, it made me cry because of the metaphors that it portrayed, and it made me just feel so many feelings. The imagery surrounding color in this novel is absolutely stunning, because every time Achilles would pop into the page, we would see gold metaphors, and Patroclus was pretty much always portrayed as like bluish, with this bluish color. So we have this balance between blue and gold, someone who shines a lot and someone who is always just behind and following this golden entity, which is almost like a god entity, because he is. So it's just, I have no words to describe how much I loved this book. And I also annotated quite a bit. I wrote on the margins, I put some themes, I tabbed it quite a bit, so you can definitely tell that I loved it. And I actually recorded a vlog talking about this in my summer vacation to Mexico. So if you want to go check it out, you can. And it's so cool to be able to say that now, as opposed to last year's video where I had no videos to go back to. Now I can say, hey, I actually talked about this book during the year, so you can go check it out if you want to. Then, the next book I want to talk about is The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. And this one was just the cutest, most wonderful story that also made me cry, but it made me laugh. It made me feel so many things, and it was just such a nice experience to be able to read a book. It was about a girl who drinks the moon, literally, and acquires some magic powers before she is ready to. And so she is taken by this witch to live with her and to save her from herself. The witch decides to put a spell on, or a curse on, the girl, so that she is not able to remember that she has magic, so that she's not able to use it. But this causes her to completely forget about magic altogether, and so she's not able to fully talk about it. And if people do talk to her about magic, she goes into a coma. And so we follow her as she grows up with the most wonderful characters I've ever read. There's this one dragon, just like a dragon buddy, that is just so cute and nice. And the innocence of growing up not knowing something and then learning about it, and how it impacts people, how secrets can sometimes be good but also bad at the same time, and everything that surrounds the context of why this happened and why she was taken away by the witch is also super interesting. But I don't really want to go into it because I think it's something that you should read. And I'm going to say, if there's any book that I would recommend in this list for absolutely anybody, it would be this one. I think it's a book that anyone can read and enjoy and love, and from children to adults, it's just a wonderful book. So my number 7 favorite book of 2022 is Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. And you can already tell that this book brings a lot of feelings of just joy in me. This is a story about a guy who meets another boy, and they become really good friends, and then they just develop into maybe something more. But it's not necessarily about that. It's about their self-discovery, their friendship, their love for each other. Nick and Charlie are just some of the most beautiful characters I've ever had the joy to read about. They're just wonderful. And this is a beautiful graphic novel with stunning artwork, gorgeous depictions of different themes. It has beautiful representation of mental health issues and just representation in general of people. So I thoroughly enjoyed this, and that's why it's on this list. And I could go on and on about it, but I think that's all I'm gonna say for Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. Number 6 in this list is Lonely Casa in the Mirror by Mizuki Tsushimura. And this was a wonderful novel about 7 children who are able to go through a mirror in their rooms and go to a lonely castle in the mirror. And they just, I don't want to really talk much about it because I think it's a book that you should go into not knowing much, but it delves with childhood and just children's perspectives represented in a way that makes sense, and it sounds like children talking, and their interactions are just wonderful. And the way that they talk to each other, the way that they support each other, the way they get to know they get to know each other, feels very real. And this book, even though it is magical realism, it feels the most real out of these, in terms of just children's voices and how they are portrayed in this novel. So I really enjoyed it, and that's why it's on this list. The next novel is a very interesting one because I read it towards the end of the year, and it was like almost like a cathartic experience for me to read it, and that is Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante. I read it in Spanish, and in Spanish it is called Los Días de Abandono. And this one was a weird experience. It's about a woman who gets divorced because her husband leaves her for another woman, and she goes absolutely crazy. She is unhinged, and this is recommended as like an unhinged women in literature book, which is my favorite genre. So I absolutely loved this novel, not because of the character itself and not because of the story itself, but because of how real it is in terms of grief and how it is represented here. Because if you've ever been through heartbreak at all in any way, shape, or form, you will know that it's one of the most painful things that you will ever have to experience. And I went through a pretty difficult heartbreak last year, and so this book, it was almost like showing me what I would like to do but I would never do like in my real life. But this woman actually does it, and that's why she's such an unlikable character, but also a very interesting character. So you like to read about what she is doing and how she's feeling, but you don't necessarily empathize with it. You just feel it to your core. And I felt empathy, but I felt apathy as well. So it was one of those books that had me like with mixed emotions, mixed feelings. But in the end, I cannot get this book out of my mind. I cannot get this novel out of my head. So it had to be on this list. And it is actually number 5. So we are halfway through. And as you can tell, I tabbed it quite a bit. I wrote on it. I would honestly write a whole ass essay about this novel. That's how interesting it is, and that's how deep it is. So it had to be on this list. The next novel on this list is a book I read at the beginning of the year, and I said when I read it that it was going to be my favorite, or one of my favorites of 2022, and that is They Never Learn by Lady Fargo. And it ended up on this list, number 4, because I absolutely adored it. It reminded me so much of A Promising Young Woman because it is about a woman professor who kills men on campus who do horrible things, either rapists or abusers or people who are just the worst. She takes it upon herself to kill them and goes around campus to campus, college to college, doing this without getting caught. And so we follow her as she commits one of the murders, but has a problem and an issue where she doesn't do it quite correctly. So now people are starting to realize what she's doing, and we follow her perspective, but we also follow a dual perspective of a girl who actually goes to this college campus and actually studies there. And we follow her experience too, as she also meets some pretty disgusting men. So this dual perspective is one of the best things I've ever read in terms of how well thought out it is and how it comes together. I know some people may not like it, but for me it was wonderful, and it was just such a good just overall storyline. So this novel marked me in the way that it became one of my favorites alongside A Promising Young Woman, and I have to pair the two together because they're just similar in different ways, and I love them both. And I think this is a book that not everybody's going to enjoy, but in my case I really enjoyed it. It's a thriller. It kept me on my toes. I really wanted to know what was going to happen, so it's just very interesting novel, and that's why it's on this list. Then we have this hunk chunky book called Nuestra Parte de Noche by Mariana Enriquez, or in English, Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is it's a novel. It's very long, very dense. It's about a father and a son who were traveling in Argentina during the Peron dictatorship, escaping from a cult who is trying to use his son as a medium to invoke the devil. Yeah, because the father has the ability to transport himself to another realm and get the darkness, because the father is actually a medium too, so they want to get the son, who is probably a medium as well, and they want to indoctrinate him into this cult. So we follow them escaping, and it is just incredible. Mariana Enriquez is my favorite author of all time, and she's just able to connect these stories so well in a way that just makes you feel so uncomfortable in the best way possible, and in a way that was dark and gritty and gory and disgusting, but at the same time just beautiful, sprinkled with beautiful writing and excellent descriptions. But this is absolutely amazing. So if you are thinking of reading Mariana Enriquez, I would highly recommend it. Maybe not starting with this one. Maybe I would start with Things We Lost in the Fire, or The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, which is another book I read this year, and I would highly recommend it because it's just an epic novel. Incredible epic novel about darkness, about cults, about father and son, toxic father and son's relationships, and how that plays out into how we develop as people. I really liked the characters, and I thoroughly enjoyed this novel. And then we are getting into my number 2 favorite book of 2022, which is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. Sorry. And this novel was very unsettling. It follows Mimi, who is married to a marine biologist called Leah, who goes on a mission on a submarine under the ocean and is supposed to come back 2 weeks later, but actually comes back 3 months later. And we follow their perspectives in the past and the present, their relationship, how it used to be, their relationship, how it is now, how Leah's trip affected her deeply to a point where she is not the same person she was before because of trauma, PTSD, but we don't know what it is caused by. And so we follow her in the submarine as she is experiencing all these things. Time passes differently, things start to happen, and we learn all about it from her perspective. But we also see the present and who she is now because of those experiences, as we follow Mimi, who is struggling with the reckoning of her relationship being completely shattered by these events. And the writing in this novel is also impeccable. Like, I would say not only is the story itself like unsettling, but the writing and the way that she's able to portray the darkness of the ocean. And for me, like, one of the most terrifying things in the world is the ocean. Like, I'm absolutely terrified of the ocean, and I completely respect the ocean. I don't really like swimming in the waves, and it just makes me like a little terrified that something is gonna come out and eat me. And so this novel was particularly scary for me, but the descriptions just make it even more terrifying. So as she is describing the dark sea, she says, "The deep sea is dark, particularly when the lights on your submersible craft have cut off for reasons unknown. I did my best to keep my gaze away from the windows, thought of strange-shaped ocean creatures peering in at the three of us and smiling with all of their teeth." That's just, I don't want to think about that. But I thought this was an incredibly unsettling and beautifully written novel. If anything, the writing just made it even better. and it was definitely 100% one of my favorite books of this year, and that's why it's on second place. There was just one novel that actually kicked it out of the first place, which is The Bird and the Sword by Amy Harmon. And this novel is not necessarily the best technically written novel or the most interesting plot-wise, but for me, it holds such a special place in my heart that I couldn't put it anywhere else. And this is a personal list, so obviously my number one is going to be my personal favorite, and this is a fantasy romance novel that I read midway through the year and just completely fell in love, and after that nothing has surpassed it. It follows a girl called Shallow who has magic powers in a world where magic is not allowed and it's actually prohibited, and if you are discovered to have magic, you are actually killed. And so at the beginning of the novel, we see her mother being discovered as someone who has magic and killed because of it. And as a way of protecting her daughter, she puts a spell on her to not be able to speak because her powers are based on words. And it's just incredible in the sense that I am a linguist and words are so important for me and for everybody, for society in general. We always say that language shapes realities, and this book portrays it perfectly, how her magic expresses itself through words, and as she is learning to read and speak and she is learning how to say things, everything starts making sense around her. So we see her shape the world around her through words. We see her fall in love with someone and have just a safe, non-toxic relationship, which I appreciated very much, because you think that this is going to be like a bad boy, horribly like toxic relationship, and it ends up being quite beautiful, and it ends up being quite nice and just a healing process for her. So I'm not really going to go into it. I don't want to describe much about it because I could go on and just spoil the whole book. But as a whole, just the linguistic aspect of it, the magic, the romance, everything combined made it so that it's just my favorite book of this year. It's still not necessarily my favorite book of all time. I think Night Bitch is probably my favorite book of all time. But if I were to say, like, out of 2022, this was definitely my favorite. It holds such a special place in my heart. I'm probably gonna reread it this year because it's another comfort book. It made me feel all sort of cute, cozy feelings, and I couldn't stop reading it at night at 3 a.m. in the morning, just trying to see where the story was gonna take us. It's a standalone, so it's even better because usually fantasy novels have like either trilogies, duologies, and this has a duology. This has a sequel, but it's not necessary, so I'm not going to read the sequel. I'm just gonna stay with the standalone. I'm just gonna stay with the first one as a standalone novel because apparently the sequel is not that good. So let's just say that this is a standalone fantasy novel that's literally stands on its own and has just some of the most incredible descriptions of linguistic knowledge that I have seen, and it made my heart very, very happy. And you know what else makes my heart really, really happy? You guys. Did you like that segue? No, but I just wanted to say thank you for being here. Thank you for watching my videos. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you pick up any of the books I mentioned from this list and that you tell me about them. Did you like them? Did you enjoy them? Did you not like them? Why? Let's have a little chat. And thank you for just another wonderful year. And I just hope this year is even better than the last one. I hope I'm able to provide more content for you, and that you're taking care of yourselves, that you're taking care of your hearts, that you're drinking lots of water, stay hydrated, and I will see you soon with another video soon. Bye bye!